Hello friends, welcome. Today is the 1st of March 2025, the day after the controversial and highly watched debate between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. I wanted to provide a clear explanation on the issue of Ukraine, with specific argumentative points so we can see exactly what each side is saying, where we stand, and our arguments. This is essentially our discussion. How are we viewing this? What are the criteria? And the events that will unfold rapidly in the coming days. For example, Zelensky's meeting with European leaders as he has just arrived in Europe, in London, and other matters we face. How do we view them to evaluate it? The reason I put this talk here is that I encountered several people who had such a request, or when they entered such a discussion about what to do with the Ukraine-Russia war, they expressed that the arguments of both sides were unclear to them, and they couldn't have a clear mind or specific stance in this discussion. So, let's summarize this issue, simplify it, and understand it clearly. I will try to do this, and I hope I succeed, but it's not certain. Now, it's a difficult task. That is, you want to translate a complex issue of international relations into straightforward logical propositions. Now I will try my best and you will judge. If there's a question, I will be at your service. For this, I will speak briefly and clearly. The main issue in this Ukraine matter, and what happened in the White House, involves a serious ethical and political question about the right way to approach international conflicts. Generally, political theories, specifically the part that deals with international relations, are divided into three schools of thought to address those questions. These schools are realists, liberals, and constructivists. These are the three main perspectives in international relations that rather complement each other than contrast. Realists say that the world is an anarchic system. We have an anarchical world. Anarchy means without government, without court, and without enforcement to implement the court's decisions. If we had a police for the world and a court that was able to handle complaints from other countries and their peoples, there should be accountability in the world, how states treat each other, and also how they treat their citizens. But now, given the status quo, we are living in the state of nature, or in a better technical term, Hobbesian state, where everybody competes against everybody to gain more power. Therefore, realists say that in an anarchic world, you need to make yourself as strong as possible to avoid being harmed by others. This world essentially operates under the law of the jungle, where the strongest wins. The narrative I provided, just to clarify, is referred to as offensive realism. The most prominent thinker of it is currently Professor John Mearsheimer, who provides a very clear, but in some respect a refutable argument on the Russia-Ukraine war. In contrast to realists, liberals argue that humanity doesn't achieve prosperity solely through competition and balance of power. Instead, we can achieve better outcomes for each other through cooperation and interaction. This interaction is shaped by relative gain, meaning that in our cooperation, one party may benefit more and the other less, but both parties benefit. There is a third school of thought known as constructivism. They argue that while the discussions of liberals and realists are both valid, they overlook a crucial reality. The internal ideology, values, norms, and culture of a country have a significant impact on its foreign policy. We must consider these factors and pay attention to the culture and internal dynamics of the country. The constructivist's perspective specifically contrasts with the realists and addresses or complements a weakness of the realists' approach, that we as Iranians dealing with an ideological regime that wants to be Islamic nuclear power totally understand and relate. Realists claim that in international relations, we don't concern ourselves with what happens within a country. They treat it as a black box, regardless of whether it is a democracy or autocracy. Therefore, it doesn't matter to us whether we have to stand against Putin or Xi Jinping because they don't have democracy in their countries, or because they are dictators who violate the human rights of their citizens. We have an assumption, and this assumption is based on a theory called rational choice theory. Rational choice theory claims the behavior that countries exhibit externally in this anarchic world is rational and logical, meaning whether they are democracies or not. They pursue their interests, regardless of what is going on in their internal affairs. We don't care if those interests belong to a dictator or the entire population of that country, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. The interests they pursue externally are rational based on what they have set for themselves, for example, to maintain their dictatorship or strengthen their democracy. On the other hand, liberals argue if there is democracy in a country, and consequently if there is free trade and a free market economy, the country becomes stronger and able to obtain the same hard power, for example, military or anything else that realists refer to. Liberals talk about cooperation, saying that through cooperation we can become stronger and more prosperous. However, when we observe the common history and culture of the Western states, no one can deny the constructivist argument, not even liberals, that cooperation is much easier because of the country's similarity in their norms and values. The fact that Western countries have been considered allies is not because they are democracies. Rather, it is because they share the same Christian values and traditions. It needs to be mentioned that when it comes to the case of Iran, the constructivist approach provides a much clearer explanation for its ideology-driven foreign policy. We see a country where its political and military leaders wish to be martyred, and at the same time pursuing nuclear weapons. How realism or rational choice theory can explain that? What would be the national interest of a country that its leaders claim death in the path of jihad is a win, is an ultimate achievement? We should read the story of Ukraine through all these three lenses. Realism, which emphasizes the military imbalance between Russia and Ukraine. Liberalism, which encourages Ukrainians, Russians, and Europeans to cooperate. And constructivism, which stresses Ukrainians' strong inclination to be considered as a member of the Western family. There is also a big segment of the Ukrainian population who are Russians and interested in Russia. But their voices have been suppressed in some areas. They have been culturally oppressed because another part of society wanted to move towards the West. In the 2014 election, it said that the U.S. spent $5 billion to incite the rebellion against a democratically elected president who did not want to take aside either the U.S. or Russia, to give a lesson that anyone who wanted to remain neutral between the West and Russia had to step aside. Now, two prominent theorists of international politics and economy have become vocal in pursuing negotiations with Russia to end the war and bring about peace. They are important figures because they provide a theoretical framework for what the Trump administration is trying to do and what would be the right approach for Europe concerning the U.S. These two individuals come from two different schools of thought. One is Professor John Mearsheimer, whose stance has been clear from the beginning because he is perhaps the leading theorist in realism. He repeatedly expresses his concerns about the current situation in war, Ukraine's struggle for manpower, and Russia's advancement on the battlefield. And then there's Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs comes from a liberal school. He shares the same concerns with Mearsheimer about the Russia-Ukraine war, but from a different approach. He believes more in economic cooperation with Russia. However, there's a very sharp and clear difference between Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer on the issue of China. We can recognize this now, right? Based on the model I've explained so far, even without any other information, I think we can now understand the kind of disagreement these two might have over China. Naturally, Mearsheimer is concerned about China. He says we must compete and ensure that they do not become more powerful than us. We should use all possible means, of course wisely, to maintain our military, technological, and economic superiority over China. That technological and economic superiority should support and bolster our military superiority as well. Therefore, in thinking about competition with China, Mearsheimer believes that the U.S. should change its focus from Europe to China, abandon Europe, and also abandon the Middle East. This pivot should happen towards China. He explains this pivot exactly after Trump's and Zelensky's talks. He says there should be a pivot. You have to turn from one place and look in another direction, changing your path. Therefore, America should let go of Europe and focus on China to be able to compete with it. Regarding China, Jeffrey Sachs thinks exactly the opposite of Mearsheimer. He says that we should engage with China as an economic competitor, we should cooperate and do business with them, not consider them an enemy, not start unnecessary conflicts, and be peace-seeking. We can work with China. China does not intend to fight or take over the world. This competitiveness, this superiority complex is within us. It's in our blood, in our mindset, and in our Western genes that we think this way and project it to our rivals. Mr. Mearsheimer, of course, doesn't think that way about China. But regarding the issue of Ukraine, they think the same. This means that liberal thinking aligns with realist thinking, and they overlap in some ways. What does liberal thinking say? It says that we should engage with Russia, with both China and Russia. There's no difference between them. Russia has no intention to invade Europe. It's a foolish and childish view to think that, for example, Russia wants to come and occupy Europe tomorrow. There is no reason to have a high-budget defensive system against Russia. We just shouldn't threaten Russia. We threatened Russia by expanding NATO eastward, which scared Putin and led to these reactions. We are stepping on Putin's toes, otherwise he has no issue with us. Now the question is whether Jeffrey Sachs is right. Let's complete his narrative to see if he is right or not. There are good examples that support Sachs' argument. The European countries that declared neutrality, like Sweden, Finland, and Austria during the Cold War and its aftermath. Did they suffer any harm from Russia? Did they lose their territory, their stability, their prosperity? Were they ever threatened by Russia? None of these things happened. Therefore, if Ukraine was invaded by Russians, it is because NATO is moving to the east, to the doorstep of Russia. This topic is known as the policy of NATO's expansion eastward. We will get to that. Now, let's get to what is currently happening. Our moral judgment should be based on the reality on the ground and the fact that Russia is advancing constantly without any major defensive obstacles, according to military experts. We are seeing the military reports that Russia is winning the war. And on the other hand, there is no opposing argument. The only opposing argument is that they say the progress of Russia in this war is currently slower than it was in the past when they quickly advanced and occupied eastern Ukraine. This argument is weak. The slow pace doesn't mean it's not a disaster. It's a human catastrophe. It doesn't mean it should continue. The argument is very weak. Well, it's slow, but Russia is advancing. What should be done in the end? What will happen in the end? Either Russia must be stopped, or at least it should halt the war, even if we don't want to push it back to where it was before. Does Europe have a choice now, or even the US? Assuming they do, and of course they do, will they reach a conclusion? You see, that's why the argument is actually where Trump and Vance and others raise their voices and speak so insultingly and disdainfully against Zelensky, because down the road their argument is logical. But now it needs an explanation. It is said that the exact number of Ukrainian casualties is not clear, but close to 1 million Ukrainians have been killed or severely injured in the war. Many of their cities have been destroyed, meaning these people have been devastated. People who were genuinely very interested in being Western, especially when you look at young Ukrainian girls and boys who were dreaming of having a Western and joyful lifestyle and are now in mourning for their loved ones. The human tragedy is immense, and the ugliest aspect of it is being translated into the issue of Ukraine's mineral and land resources. See how this makes the scene so ugly and makes people angry, but we also need to understand the reasoning behind it. Why do we even reach a point where such a contradiction between people's lives, their dignity, and the issue of trade happens? What Trump is saying is a correct argument, that the war should end as soon as possible. But the way it is expressed concerning trade is the ugliest form you can give to a correct argument. The story of the Ukraine war has turned upside down because of having no plan for the endgame and also the bad players among Ukrainian allies in the West. I hope that at least those of us who try to think about the issue among ourselves understand it, think about it correctly, and recognize it properly. I promise you, it will have an impact on our personal lives, in the analyses we do in our emotional lives with our partners, with anyone else, with the people at the corner store. It helps us, and it gives us power in our reasoning and judgment, so that maybe we can do something right for our country and the Middle East. We are a generation that either has to sit back and just watch, or we want to create a change for ourselves and the generations after us. If that's the case, we need to have a clear picture and objective view to understand the issue and avoid the same experience for ourselves. Well, look, what's happening on the ground is that Russia is advancing and pushing forward every day. And Trump either can't or doesn't want to provide Ukraine with the military resources needed to stop Russia. And even if he does provide such resources, to what extent can he force Russia to retreat? These are unanswered questions. From a moral standpoint, if we think about it, even if one less person is killed or one less life is destroyed, achieving a ceasefire right now is ethical, isn't it? Very well, so let's see what the approach to achieving this is. Realism perhaps gives us a good foundation for the right approach. They say we need to wrap up this story as soon as possible because we are losing every day and Russia is winning the war. Interestingly, the realist perspective in this context is a moral one, even though it doesn't claim to be. Realists argue, whatever has happened in the past, let's discuss it later on. Right now, what's happening on the ground is that Russia is advancing and nothing is stopping it. Lives are being lost. So we should even give concessions and tell Russia, please stop the war. What do you want us to give you to back off? Mearsheimer, however, takes a different approach to Israel and the Middle East affairs. He, along with Stephen Walt, another realist from Harvard University, who is also a prominent theorist, wrote a book named The Israel Lobby and the U.S. Foreign Policy, criticizing U.S. diplomacy for being an unlimited and always available apparatus for Israel's regional interests. But I hadn't seen him so openly since the week of October 7th, when Mearsheimer came in front of the camera to talk about Israel, particularly Netanyahu, and the genocide he is committing against Palestinians. He based his argument on moral judgment, saying that America has no right, cannot, and should not, whether it's Biden's America or even Trump's America, assist Netanyahu in this genocide. This would also weaken America. From this perspective, realists are not necessarily unethical. They are not just self-serving. Let me explain. Let's say we're just seeking to gain more power, but power is closely tied to ethics. Even the manpower you have on the battlefield needs morale. Moreover, one of the things that realists emphasize is the credibility of words. The President of the United States must have credibility in his words. A superpower's credibility means that when it threatens, even if it doesn't use military force, the other countries take it seriously, not only because it is capable of delivering its threat, but also because it is credible in terms of morality and trust. That's why many people condemned Trump and Vance's behavior in conversation with Zelensky in the Oval Office. One of their main arguments is that they blurred the line between the aggressor and the victim. They say why you are yelling at the victim and not the aggressor. European leaders ask American leaders why they do not condone Russia's aggression. This is a very important point, especially from the perspective of third parties, such as the Islamic Republic. Players like our regime, players like Saudi Arabia, Israel, other European countries, Latin American countries, African countries, everywhere, specifically Europe, that Russia is the aggressor in this situation, but it can evade U.S. wrath because it is a nuclear power. What do the realists say here? The realists say that yes, Russia is an aggressor, but it is a nuclear power and it has the upper hand right now. They don't have much of an argument in this area. They say at the beginning it was possible to stop the war through negotiation, but you didn't do that, and now the game is in their hands. Russia is in the driver's seat and is moving forward. So, what do you want to do now? By saying that Russia is an aggressor, what do you achieve? At the end of the day, you should comply with Russian terms. Doesn't that make you a hypocrite? Do you just want to say Russia is an aggressor and then beg Putin to back down? What do you gain by declaring Russia an aggressor? Whatever you call it, the reality on the ground will determine your position. Realists say you have no choice, and ask about the alternative solution to a possible nuclear war. Do you need to go and negotiate with Russia, or do you want to start World War III and try to put Russia in its place with nuclear power? They give this response. But does this statement have no answer? It does have an answer. And in the overall solution, as we move forward, we will all come to only one conclusion, which I will point out. But first, we need to ask them what they achieved by humiliating and yelling at the victim. Is this necessary to bring him to the negotiation table, or it is counterproductive and makes the issue more difficult to deal with? If realists admit that the Ukrainian war is a natural consequence of humiliating Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that it's an American mistake, then why you're now supporting Trump's disrespectful conversation with Ukraine? Let's see what happened in the UN Security Council 2 days before Zelensky visited the White House. Historically unprecedented, we have seen in the Security Council that the US, Russia, and China stand on one side, while European countries stand on the other. These three have avoided labeling Russia as an aggressor. Well, it's clear why China wouldn't, and obviously Russia wouldn't label itself as an aggressor. The US is also not willing to label Russia as an aggressor. Why? Because this stirs up the past debate that the realists and liberals are talking about. They say we made a mistake from the beginning. The story goes back 30 years. In fact, from the perspective of a liberal like Jeffrey Sachs, who naturally states this more clearly than Mearsheimer, the real culprit for the current situation in Ukraine is the United States itself. The US is to blame in this story. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was humiliated. At that time, Russia had expressed interest in even joining NATO. Putin mentioned this recently in his interview with Tucker Carlson. However, the Clinton administration did not agree. Initially, Clinton himself had shown interest, but according to Jeffrey Sachs, what we know as the deep state stopped Clinton, and there is a lot of evidence for this. So just imagine you don't accept Russia's request to join NATO. Instead, you encourage its neighbor to become a member. What would you expect from Russia? Does Putin have a right not to trust the West and react against humiliation? And more importantly, do you do the same humiliation against Ukraine? Haven't you learned your lesson? The issue of trust exists in both parties, Russia and Ukraine, concerning U.S. international commitments. Ukraine also has a right not to trust the U.S. and asks for security assurance. This goes back to the agreements in 1994 between Russia, the United States, and the UK with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. It's called the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurance, in which Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear arsenals to sign the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT. In the Budapest Agreement, Ukraine was a main player because it had the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. Ukraine was considered the third largest nuclear military power in the world. Ukraine signed the NPT, handing over the responsibility for their security to these countries under the Budapest Memorandum. Well, Russia, 20 years later, breached the Budapest Memorandum when it attacked and annexed Crimea in 2014. Now we understand why the issue of trust and credibility matters. Humiliation also plays a vital role in the international system. The humiliation of Germany after World War I led to the humiliation of the German people and a historical inflation in their economy, a good reason for them to stand behind Hitler. Hitler came to power through a democratic election, and then the humiliation of the people was the West's mistake. They learned from these mistakes, and in World War II, they acted exactly the opposite. Not only did they not humiliate Germany, but they also provided it with unconditional financial aid through the Marshall Plan, allowing Germany to rebuild itself into the strong nation we see today. Germany became a major partner of the United States. However, in the 1990s, the U.S. humiliated the Soviet Union, treating it as a defeated rival, which led to America becoming the unchallenged global superpower. This arrogance, which Jeffrey Sachs strongly criticizes, is a foolish pride that makes Americans believe they can always dictate terms to the world. This mindset still influences U.S. foreign policy today, regardless of any changes. Therefore, we need to move away from this perspective of being the world's boss. The current situation is a result of humiliating Russia. Putin's reactions are similar to Hitler's, aiming to restore the greatness and dignity that have been trampled upon. We need to recognize this and adjust our behavior accordingly. Now let's see what would be the real impact of humiliating Zelensky. Is it just an unethical act, or it also has unintended consequences? Imagine right now, world leaders, especially leaders of countries like ours, are watching Mr. Trump and seeing how he is berating Zelensky, shouting at him, saying that you have no card without us, you have no power now, you have lost the game, you have no advantage. So what they are thinking. Our main issue with humiliation is always this. If we pay attention to our experiences of being humiliated or humiliating others, or any kind of experience, we notice that a part of it involves cold realities. The subtlety and moral value of the subject show here in how we choose to express this reality. Are we trampling on the self-esteem of that individual, or in this case, the self-esteem of a country or a nation, since this representation comes from them? Or are we elevating the dignity of others while telling them the truth? More importantly, Trump's insult wasn't just an insult to Zelensky. Whether Zelensky thanked us for this or not, Zelensky is the representative of his people and their legitimate representative. He is not a dictator. We must recognize him as the legitimate representative. Why? Because I want to point this out. Before addressing the insult itself and its implications, I point out this part first. When you humiliate a nation, you will see their revenge to reestablish their dignity someday, in some way. Let me clarify that this was not an insult to an individual, but an insult to a nation, because Zelensky has legitimacy and represents his people. Contrary to that tweet by Trump, which claimed he was a dictator, elections in Ukraine have not been held because of the war situation. Zelensky came to power through elections, was accepted by the people, and was popular. During the war, he stood firm, and because of the wartime conditions, elections were not held. This is part of Ukraine's constitution and has been accepted by the people. No one has raised the issue that Zelensky lacks legitimacy as a social demand. Up to this point, we do not see any social protest questioning his legitimacy. Now, looking at it realistically, the question is, who would be Zelensky's successor? Those who are currently considered potential successors also have military roles and have been heavily involved in the war. They also cannot go and sign a peace agreement right now, which means this dilemma could become even more severe. It might ultimately lead to a conclusion where they decide to remove Zelensky, but for now, such a scenario is not foreseeable. However, this wouldn't solve the issue. It would only complicate it further. Think about it logically. Imagine someone who has been involved in this Ukraine war and the suffering of the people, now going to kneel before Putin and sign. This person has destroyed himself if anyone does such a thing. The NATO Secretary General also supported Trump in a way, albeit with reservations, trying to be precise. They should note that Zelensky's resignation doesn't solve the issue. It can even make the situation much more complicated. Zelensky was humiliated, and if we look at the applications or messages, let's look at the reality. What factor? Now everyone in the world is watching, everyone who saw the video, and all the world leaders watched it too. What factor causes this? The first question is, what factor causes Trump to yell at Zelensky like that and humiliate him, and before him King Abdullah of Jordan in almost the same way, and Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, in almost the same way again? I mean, Trump has shown no respect to anyone. Up to this point, he has approached many through humiliation, except for Putin. What are we seeing in this theatrical scene that makes Putin an exception for Trump? It's very clear. The fact that a strong man, or rather a powerful man with nuclear weapons, makes Trump come out and say that everything must be done now and belittle the victim for this matter. What does this bring to the minds of the Saudi leadership, Mr. Erdogan, the Islamic Republic, all their associates, and many other players? They secretly go after nuclear weapons. Because the only way they can save themselves from such humiliation and earn respect is to go to nuclear weapons and show themselves as a man of means. Specifically, this issue is the relationship between nuclear weapons and a man of means, a strong man, a dictator, not nuclear weapons in democratic countries like France, because it will never be used there. That's why the threat of nuclear weapons from France doesn't exist from America's perspective. Authority and nuclear weapons, dictatorship and nuclear weapons become frightening, This will bring respect for Mr. Trump or respect for America. So it follows that here you see how a change or a moral issue can have a significant impact at the highest level you can imagine on reality. This is also a childish distinction that we've heard, a cliché that these things, morality and politics, are unrelated, and yet they are related. Another false dichotomy we hear frequently is that national interests and human rights go in a different direction. They say that, for instance, America is pursuing its national interests, therefore it doesn't pay attention to human rights. Or you have to sacrifice some of your national interests to pay attention to human rights issues in the world. This is also one of those foolish statements that is often used. You've heard it many times, and it can be repeated many times, from journalists and television to political leaders who might say this. But this is also not a correct interpretation of national interests. For example, the national interests of the United States. To grow in a free economy and compete with China, America's advantage lies in being able to engage in trade and interaction with the world, being the most important player in the global economy and keeping its economy open. So discussions like tariffs or topics like a weak economic partner are detrimental to the U.S. If the countries in the region become powerful and economically capable, it benefits the U.S. Currently, the countries in the region that are economically capable are either spending their nation's oil money on themselves or have very good relations with the U.S. For example, Saudi Arabia says it wants to invest $600 billion in the U.S., like Iran, which uses it for terrorism, Islamism, jihad, and suppressing its citizens. But this resource will eventually run out. America's long-term interests lie in establishing democracy in the Middle East. In establishing and supporting the slogans of freedom fighters, if women in the Middle East grow, the Middle East will grow. If women in the Middle East flourish and are free, the Middle East will grow and become a powerful economic partner like Germany after World War II with America. These are the national interests of the United States. The national interests of the United States lie in having an idea, the idea of a free world, the idea of human rights, and the idea of supporting human dignity. The idea that the Founding Fathers had from the beginning made America the leader of the world. The world accepted that, although America had superior military power, it also had a set of moral principles that made countries want to get closer to America. The inclination to move closer wasn't because of America's military power. This tendency to move closer to the West, which exists in Ukraine, Venezuela, Iran, Europe, and Turkey, is due to the issue of freedom of choice, due to the issue of human rights. It's because of the support for this type of lifestyle and this understanding of life that America has had. This has given America credibility. But what about Russia's credibility? How we can trust Putin if we sign an agreement with him? Realists and liberals both blame the U.S. for imposing threats to Russia by expanding NATO eastward. They also remind us about America's 3 decades of wrongdoing toward Russia, which itself has been complicit in the rise of Putin and the events happening today. But there's another side to this balancing: Russia's wrongdoing and misperception. Here we find out that the perspective of both liberals and realists, which now is translating to President Trump's Russia approach, has a major flaw. It looks like they see Putin as if he is a gorilla that behaves just based on its instinct, and it is on us to treat them with consideration like a zookeeper. We should be careful with a gorilla so it doesn't grab and eat us. Therefore, you should not show any sign of threats, rather give him whatever he is asking for to appease him. But our question is it a threat to Russia if Ukraine joins NATO? Is Putin concerned about such a scenario in which NATO would launch a missile into Russian territory? With the behavior that the CIA has had, with the coups that the CIA has carried out in the past, with the way we've acted in the world, we were at fault, and now we need to back down and sit in our place. This statement by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs as an American is correct. This perspective is a correct one. Let's look at our flaws. But one thing that they forget, even the realists forget. It doesn't matter here whether you have a liberal perspective or a realist one, whether you are cooperative or competitive. What is the responsibility of the other side? The other side is not just a guerrilla acting solely on its instincts. Just because it feels threatened, it doesn't have the right to take over Ukraine because NATO made a mistake and threatened it. We see the same behavior with the statesmen, or rather, the rulers of the Islamic Republic, and this is particularly painful for us. This part is where we feel the pain. We ask, why are you willing to give them so much leeway? Why don't you hold them accountable if you consider such rationality for America? Why don't you apply the same standards to other players? What about holding them responsible? What about holding an aggressor accountable? Fine, it was a wrong move for NATO to want to expand eastward. Agreed, we shouldn't have come to Russia's neighborhood to threaten it. Agreed, when Russia wanted to join NATO, we should have accepted it and embraced it in the West as one of us. If we had done that, we wouldn't be facing the current damage, and we are all suffering from it now. But on the other hand, is Russia a child to see this as a threat? If we are supposed to negotiate with them, what about them? Shouldn't they come to negotiate too? Shouldn't this relationship be reciprocal? Shouldn't we consider the fact that Putin is a dictator? We want to appease him because he is the true representative of the Russian nation, or it's because he has nuclear power. Now, what is the solution? The solution we want to find now is what we should do. Something very clear with the reasoning we've just discussed. Even though I spoke at length here, it could certainly be shorter. It is that we must stop this war in any way possible. This should be our main goal, and we have to find the best way to achieve it with dignity for Ukraine. To stop the continuation of this war, a ceasefire should happen today. This is the most ethical and logical way, and we will move in this direction. Interestingly, the most ethical way also turns out to be the most logical and plausible approach to the conflict. It becomes inevitable on its own. We should remember that having a fantastical view of ethics is incorrect. Ethics are not separate from our daily lives. If we think they are, then we have a wrong understanding of ethics. We might be people who are detached from reality and the functionality of our daily base life, giving a concept of ethics that is far from practical. Think about it. In your logical and daily life, the issue of ethics must be present. We should construct and define our interests based on ethics. We will realize soon that is more practical and sustainable. So we agree there must be a ceasefire. Sending arms to Ukraine hasn't kept Russia out of their land, and it won't in the future. Now, what should we do for a ceasefire? This becomes the question for all of us. So what is the best way, the best scenario, the solution to this conflict that we now see as so complicated? It's rather simple. Mr. Putin should be contacted, Mr. Trump should call, Zelensky should call, and the Europeans should call. Europe should have a direct, cohesive, and independent foreign policy with Russia. Amazingly, they don't. That's childish. Okay, we realize that our first task is to reopen the channel of communication with Russia. Western leaders should call Putin and say, "Sir, we want a ceasefire today." You're saying the main issue is that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. Very well. We accept that. We'll give you a guarantee that Ukraine won't join NATO. In return, we must condemn your aggression. We must know how you guarantee our security, both individually and collectively. What do you put on the table? The second issue is related to Crimea. It's not like Ukraine just suddenly decided to join NATO. You took Crimea. Since then, even before that, there was this lie that some people were spreading. Ukraine didn't want to join NATO. It had been applied before, but after 2014, this request became more serious. First of all, the people of Ukraine wanted to join Europe, but they didn't want to necessarily join NATO or to get involved in this conflict. But now they are caught up in it. In a way, they are destroyed. Therefore, even if Ukraine had requested to join NATO, even if that request had been accepted immediately, it still wouldn't justify your invasion. Not a single missile was fired from Ukraine or any other NATO members toward Russia before your invasion. Now, there was also the issue of separatists and Russian minorities in Eastern Europe. That complicates the matter in the East. But nobody talks about it. Nobody considers these dynamics as a major factor in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. They are a minority, Russian people living in the Baltic countries and Ukraine. and they are being oppressed. So Russia has a voice on that side too. So, you have to pay for this. If we can make you pay today, we will. If we can't make you pay today, it will be recorded in history, and someday you will have to pay anyway. You were the aggressor, and your excuse is not justified. However, we will leave out that excuse. We stopped the process of Ukraine joining NATO, and you should stop the war. We consider Ukraine to be part of the European Union, but not NATO. And overall, we are approaching a situation where the main party of NATO, which is the US, is in conflict with Europe over this NATO issue. Mr. Merz is also saying that as he becomes the German chancellor, the fate of NATO will change. So Europeans, who play the main role here, should come up with a new vision, tasks, and new structure for NATO. Some people are now saying that Europe should have its own NATO, its army, and a strong defense force. I see them on various media outlets saying these things. They claim that Europe cannot defend itself without America and American support. Therefore, they argue that Europe needs to move forward with NATO and bow to America and Mr. Trump, which was a central point in the NATO Secretary General's statement. The answer to these illusional concerns is very clear. The answer is, why do you think you need to increase your defense budget? It was not wise from the beginning that it goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union to keep NATO after the Warsaw Pact. What is the point of keeping NATO when you have so many issues with Turkey in the easternmost? When you do not share the same norms and values with the Islamic government of Turkey, and also with the US in the westernmost of the alliance, given that they are not interested in NATO. It's quite funny that if we read the whole story backward, we then have to deal with its consequences, and those consequences become complicated. For example, you encounter the rise of the right wing in Europe. Well, that's because you read the story backward from the start, and you want to maintain the status quo based on a wrong framing of the problem. The right wing has become more popular in Europe because of the immigration issue. They say they are concerned about Western culture being destroyed by people who come to their countries. They raise many issues, but none of them is related to Russia. So why they are pro-Russia? Why do European right-wingers support Russia? Because of a very fundamental mistake we had here in our stance against Russia. You see, rational people like Jeffrey Sachs in his speeches in the European Parliament a few days before the incident that Zelensky experienced with Trump in the White House, saying, "You come and look at the issue rationally and put aside your Russophobia, go negotiate with Russia, talk to them, and take this excuse away from your right-wingers." The only question that arises here is whether we should negotiate with dictators, for example, the Islamic Republic and such. Let me address this question from a moral standpoint based on the philosophy of ethics and realism at the end of my talk. The issue of negotiation, in general, doesn't change whether you're talking to a dictator or a true representative of their people. Negotiation and communication must take place. The opposite is foolish and childish. To say that you won't talk to someone because they are a murderer, for example, not talking to Netanyahu because he has committed crimes. As long as he has power and can continue his actions, meaning he has agency and can perform actions and have an impact, you have a moral duty to negotiate with him. Even if it's Hitler, you have to negotiate with him unless you can kill him or stop his actions at that time. The goal is to put a stop to his actions, either by using military force, nuclear power, or any other means, and ensure that you end the story there, stopping his actions. Otherwise, you have to achieve this through negotiation. There is no other solution. But negotiation is not a sign of approval of dictatorship either. This argument exactly weakens the reverse argument that we are moving toward negotiation because by sulking and not talking, we achieve nothing. Another issue in the stance of people like Jeffrey Sachs and others who talk about the decline of America and the decline of liberal democracy is that they, for example, Jeffrey Sachs himself, have become disillusioned with America. They say that we, who claimed liberal democracy, who claimed human rights, who claimed to engage with the world and promote American values and other human values, were corrupt at this level, creating pollution in the world at this level. We were also corrupt, We also disrupted the global order for our interests. Not even our interests, but the interests that a CIA officer understands, and with power, meaning short-term interests, not a deep, broad vision. We advanced with such interests. We staged coups, we played hardball, we interfered in Ukraine's elections, we did all these things everywhere. So we are not exactly the paragons of virtue as a liberal democracy to be deciding for others like Putin. We shouldn't be concerned with their dictatorship or democracy at all. Is this argument correct? No. It's wrong. Very clearly wrong. If you weren't a good liberal democracy, then become a good liberal democracy. It doesn't mean you should turn around and say, well, then we accept dictators in the world. America is an idea, an example of a functioning and powerful liberal democracy. It should draw a clear line between itself and those countries who are still struggling with dictatorship and the idea of a strong man dictating their destiny. Or the other response I always give: if you made wrong, mistaken, destructive, warmongering interventions in the world, espionage, hardball tactics, assassinations, coups, anything in the world, if America made wrong interventions in the world, that doesn't mean that from today onwards it should stop intervening. When it comes to human rights abuse, of oppression of protesters in countries like our Iran, it is the expected role and responsibility of the U.S., if it claims itself as a leader of the free world, to intervene and to make good interventions, to make the right interventions. Europe should align itself with America and build up an independent and clear channel of diplomacy with Russia. This war must end because Europe cannot bring this war to another conclusion. The goal is for it to stop. Either Russia is defeated or retreats because such a thing does not exist in reality, so Europe will also be coming to the negotiation table. Concession on Ukrainian territories is unfortunately inevitable at this moment, but everything else looks manageable. However, humiliation is not manageable or forgettable. The main issue is that humiliating Zelensky is as dangerous as continuing this war because it humiliates an entire nation and essentially fuels the fire for future wars. Someday in the future, it is yet to be seen. Thank you for your time.